Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi. We've got a really interesting show today. We're going to be talking about sudden and traumatic loss, and we've had that in our lives, and we've got some experts and people who've had it in their lives. But before we get started with the show, I wanted to remind people that our new book that I wrote with my fiance, Dr. Frank Powers, Open to Love, The Secrets of Senior Dating, is now on Amazon. And we know that the Surgeon General has told us that one of the biggest issues in the United States today is loneliness. And this book is our experience, our journey of finding love after my husband of 60 years passed away and my partner after a divorce. And we have found love together, and we've given you some ideas that we have as therapists and as partners about what you can do to find love in your life. Because, Heidi, we believe that there's somebody out there for everyone.
I think this is true, Mom, and all proceeds will go to the Open to Hope Foundation.
Absolutely, with the mission of helping people find hope after loss.
Yep.
Well, Heidi, do you want to introduce our guest again and our topic?
Sure. The topic is sudden traumatic loss, and like you said, Mom, everyone here today has unfortunately experienced that. So we'll be talking about how do we navigate it, how do we get through it, how do we find hope again, how do we live with it, etc. So I will introduce our guests. Abby Dart is sitting closest to us.
Hi, Abby.
Hello.
Hello, Abby.
Nice to be here.
Abby holds a law degree from Loyola Law School and is a member of the California Bar. She worked in the political arena to build awareness about our mental health system, and she's still building awareness. In 2004, her husband, Steve, a Harvard and Oxford educated lawyer who seemed to have it all, died by suicide. Abby talks publicly about this in the hope that it will help others.
Yes,
So,
thank you.
welcome, Abby.
Welcome, Abby. Yes.
And next to Abby is Meghan Riordan-Jarvis. Meghan has a master's degree, and she is also a licensed clinical social worker. She is an author, podcast host. Her podcast is Grief is My Side Hustle. She is a 2-time TEDx speaker, and she has created the Grief Mentor Method to help everyone create a structured, personalized grief process. Meghan has written 2 books, a memoir called End of the Hour, which is right here,
End of the hour.
which has some information about sudden traumatic loss in it, which we'll be talking about.
And about her parents, who both died, and her mother. Her dad had cancer, so she knew that he was going to pass away, but her mother died suddenly.
Yeah. And she's got a book that's coming out October 2024 called Can Anyone Tell Me Why? Essential Questions About Grief and Loss. And we will definitely have to have her on again once that is out.
Absolutely.
So welcome to the show, Meghan.
Thank you.
Well, Abby and Meghan, why don't we start with you, Abby, and why don't you tell us a bit about your story to begin?
Right. So 20 years ago, in 2004, my husband, Steve, who had been dealing with some significant mental health issues, died by suicide. And I mean, there's so much to say. I mean, the overview is that he had been struggling for some time with difficulty sleeping and anxiety. I think he was a very successful lawyer, had run for office, very kind of a public figure, and I think a type A, and I think many men, I've talked to many men since his suicide, are very reluctant to seek treatment, seek mental health treatment, whereas they might go to the doctor for high blood pressure or diabetes, and that was really part of the problem. He wouldn't seek treatment, and of course, by the time he did, he was hospitalized in a suicidal state.
Yeah, the stigma around suicide is
The stigma is
high.
profound.
And being suicidal and paying for treatment so that you, on your insurance, you
Right.
get, it's in your record.
Right, and
So,
that was
and
part
he
of
was a political person.
a very political person in the public eye, had just started a relatively new position, and interestingly, without going into detail, this position required drug testing. So he wasn't going to take medication.
Okay.
I mean, everything sort of combined in the imperfect storm.
Yeah,
if
right.
you would say that. And so.
And what a shock, and we'll talk
Yes.
to about how you took him to the hospital, because Meghan, we were talking about your mother dying suddenly. We'll tell the story, but you were also saying that you took her into the hospital and came out and didn't catch it. And in some way, that's similar with Abby's story. So tell us about your story.
Yeah, so my mom she and I were scheduled to take a trip to Maine, and my older sister called and said, Mom hasn't been feeling well. She has a stomach bug. And I was flying up from D.C. I met her at Logan Airport, and she didn't look well. She was a little bit gray, and I said, what's going on? And, she really wanted to see me, and we really wanted to take this trip together. My dad had died a couple of years prior, and it was really one of the first trips my mom was taking without him. And so we drove up to Maine, and I had an eye on her. I was watching her. She was eating, but not much. And she was taking, home remedies and over-the-counter remedies for what seemed to be a really significant stomach bug. We spent a few days together in Maine, and then I went back to D.C. And then oddly, just because this is how the calendar worked, I came back to her house 2 days later for our vacation that we take every year. And 2 days later, she looked gray to me. And so I managed to convince her. My mother was very stoic, and if you weren't bleeding, were you really sick kind of person. We grew up on a farm. She just was very stalwart in her.
I was going to say she raised 6 children.
Yeah, she had 6 kids. She had a natural childbirth. She was 5 feet tall and like 88 pounds, but she never really needed the doctor's help.
Yeah.
So, and there had been a stomach flu or something going around. But I did manage. I said to her, I had woken with sort of a sense of panic in the morning and went into her bedroom almost half expecting to see her collapsed on the floor, which actually oddly is then what happened days later. I wasn't the one to find her. My husband was.
Oh, wow. So your husband was. But
yeah.
A sudden shock. Were you in town then?
We were. So I was about an hour away picking up my godson with my kids in the minivan. And I had taken my mom to the hospital a few days before. And at the hospital, they ran the tests that you run. And what I now understand, because I think she died of a bleeding ulcer, that's some information that doctors have given me, although we didn't get an autopsy, and so I don't know. But they're notoriously hard to catch. And so, but it would explain her symptoms, it would explain her pain.
So you heard where you were driving the car and your husband called you, as I remember from your book?
It's almost backwards than that. So what actually happened was I was driving, I had my 3 kids in the car. We pulled up to my godson's house, and I had the sensation of water breaking in my stomach.
Wow.
So much, so real that I looked down expecting, and I was not pregnant. And then I had a thought that sort of came from the back of my head, which I've had other clients described, which was, she died.
Wow.
And so I called my husband, who was back at the house where my mom was, and said, have you seen my mom? I think she may be dead. Wow. And he went in. And so I started driving. The kids got back in the car. Now I had an extra kid in the car. I started driving, and then my husband called me and said, I need you to pull over.
Wow.
So that he could tell me.
Wow. So I want to say that your dad had died a couple of years before, she died 2 years later. And then we'll get to your story of what happened to you after that. But I'm going to go to Heidi and say, when your brother was killed, do you want to talk about your trauma?
When my brother was killed?
Yeah.
Okay. You mean when I got the call, or what are you referring to?
How you found out
yes,
and your
okay.
trauma.
So, and I'm thinking about Abby too, because I'm guessing this is resonating with all of us.
It's hard.
Yeah, right?
Bringing it all back.
So I guess, I got a call in the middle of the night I found out from an uncle, but I talked to you in the middle of the night, and my mother, it was interesting because, it was so shocking, and I physically reacted. I physically got sick.
Yeah, of course.
Which I wasn't expecting, because nobody talks about that. I'm like, why am I throwing up? This is weird. But I remember my mother telling me she was sorry because she felt like she should have saved him, even though she wasn't there. Yeah. I said, Mom, you weren't even there. And she said, I know, but I should have done something. I should have stopped it. I should have been there. I go, he was in a car with my cousin, and my cousin was driving, and they both died. It was interesting, though. It's interesting how we kind of, okay, so what's coming up for you, Abby?
What I just thought was when you said your cousin, whether I mean, my case is a little bit different, but was there blame? I mean, I'm just, maybe this is another discussion, but, it's another family member.
I think that the guilt, and you talk about the guilt, from my guilt that I wasn't, there taking care of him, driving the car, as cousin was, and Heidi, her response to it, she wasn't with me, but we, it is traumatic, I think, is our main thing.
And Abby, as far as the blame, I think it was hard for me because Matthew died also.
Yeah.
The person that was, my cousin that was driving. So I felt almost like, okay, I can't be mad at Matthew because he's dead. It was really interesting. Had he lived, it might have been a different feeling.
Well, also, I was nearly killed by a drunk driver years ago.
Wow.
So, and I know a lot, I worked with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and I dealt with a lot of mothers who had lost their children. And they directed their anger at somebody, right? At somebody, and they gave victim statements, and I mean, it was quote unquote helpful to them to direct it at somebody.
Well, one thing about their accident was his mother is my most beloved best friend, like a sister to me. So I could not blame her son because he was dead.
No, but you could go together help each other.
Yeah, and it was interesting because the police did a toxicology report and everything, and the police, we talked to them after, my husband and I, and we went to the site, and the police took us in and showed us all the pictures, and we went to see everything. And one of the things that really disturbed the police was that neither of them had any drugs or alcohol in their system. And they were like, they couldn't find a reason.
Right.
But it was pouring rain, and the car hydroplaned, and they hit a wall, and the car blew up, and they burned to death. So, it was very, very traumatic. But my husband was angry at the family.
My dad was angry.
Yeah, so, he did blame the family.
So, I don't talk about it, but I'm going to talk about it here. My husband was let out of the hospital in a suicidal state. He was supposed to go back for what they have like outpatient, which was ridiculous because he should have been inpatient.
Right.
As I say to many people, if he had been hospitalized with a heart attack, like, oh, I don't want to be here anymore, do you think they would have let him just leave in a cab?
No.
But I got the call, so he didn't show up for the outpatient. Okay? It was the next day. And I got a call from the social worker. Can you imagine? From the hospital, do you know where your husband is? And I'm thinking, why would I know where he is? He's supposed to be in your care. So they're frantically looking for him, and I took my daughter. The hospital was in a different city, and I took my daughter to the dentist, and she was in the dental chair, and that's when I got the call from my nephew that found him.
Wow. Oh, wow. So, how did he kill himself?
He slit his wrists in a bathtub.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah. At home?
At his sister's, because that's where he was living. He'd taken a new job, and we were all moving down to the location.
Okay. Wow.
Well, I think these situations are important because when I tell people my brother died, since this is a traumatic loss show, my mother tells you that the car he was driving in blew up. We're telling very graphic things here because it's trauma. So it's interesting because when I tell most people, I just say he died in a car accident, and that's the end of the story. So, but as you all know, the way someone died impacts the way that we grieve. And I don't know if, Meghan, you can speak to that a little bit, because I know that you work in trauma.
So I'm thinking about this from the trauma therapy perspective, and I think a lot about the idea of guilt and sort of what is the purpose of it. So what I say to folks, because my dad died of cancer, which means I sort of participated in his death. He was given a lethal diagnosis of a cancer that was absolutely going to kill him and typically kills people within a year. There wasn't any equivocating. And so I flew back and forth from Massachusetts to see him. And the way that I describe that is that I consciously took sips from a cup of grief every weekend.
That's interesting.
That I participated in it. And when you think about what your brain does, right? Because when we're talking about trauma, what we're really saying is my central nervous system was overwhelmed by a piece of information that it couldn't take in, and then it immediately made me sort of ring like a gong, right? And then I was confused. People often have really odd behavior when they get that information, and then they have a secondary sort of trauma around what they did and said because it's nonsensical. But your brain is literally misfiring because it cannot comprehend
Flooding.
the attachment disruption that it's that it has, that it's being described. So I think when we're talking about grief and we're talking about traumatic loss, we really have to look at, if the first thing that I did with my dad was taking cups of grief, my mother's death was like being waterboarded, like
That's a
almost
good way to describe
drowning
it.
and dying from all the gallon of grief that was being choked down my throat.
Now, and I want to talk about that in the fact that you are so put together today.
Yeah, I sure wasn't then.
And tell people what happened to you, because I think that's important. You're looking at her now, and
I know. So the very first thing that happened, the minute my husband told me that my mother died, and remember, I had already told him that she died. So he told me that she died, and I had a thought that came at me like a bus. Immediately, my very first thought was, it's your fault she died. And I know about that because I treat
I think we
people,
all felt that
right?
way, didn't we? I don't know. Did you feel any?
I felt survivor guilt, but I didn't feel like it was my fault.
Yeah.
But my mother definitely felt like that.
I wanted to share one little thing that I felt some guilt because somehow he wasn't really being honest with me, but he said he wanted out of the hospital and he wanted to see the kids, and he was in a really horrible state. And I felt, I don't know if I knew it was going to happen, but I felt like that I didn't want the kids to remember their dad, to see him in this like fetal position, a horrible state. They already knew something was wrong.
Yeah.
And I just said, no. I don't know. I still think it was the right decision, but.
I think what happens to us, I mean, if we think about, our thoughts and our behaviors, they're all sort of symptoms of us trying to navigate this impossible place. The very first thought that I had was, it's my fault that she died. When I called all 5 of my brothers and sisters, I was like, you are a trauma therapist. They're going to remember this moment for the rest of their lives. I had enough wherewithal to step out of the view of the kids that were in the minivan where it was like idling, waiting for me to get back in. But I said to every one of my siblings, I think it's my fault. And every one of them said back to me, it's not your fault.
I would think
but
that.
it didn't rest. I have a friend who later in the day, after I had been with my mother's body and, the funeral home had come, later in the day, I said, you have to let me say this. She's a therapist. You have to let me say this. I think it's my fault she died. And my friend said, I'm not going to take that from you.
Right.
And I'm so sorry you have to feel that way.
Right.
But I understand that you do.
Yeah.
I love that she gave you space.
I mean, she's
Rather
a
than
therapist,
try
but
to
I
tamper it
didn't
down.
quiet. Like I needed to believe that I had some kind of agency in the crazy thing that was
But even at
unfolding in
that,
front
you
of me.
checked yourself into
I did.
a mental or a,
Yeah,
we call it a
we
mental.
can call it a mental. It's known as an inpatient trauma care center in Tennessee.
And you were there for how long?
I was there for 28 days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you were able to do
Which
that.
felt like a
and
minute.
just-
Yeah, I mean, what happened to me in the trauma, right, the waterboarding of the experience is I stopped sleeping. I didn't sleep more than maybe 20 minutes at a time for 2 hours, at a spell. I didn't eat, and I was concealing it. I knew enough to sort of hide it. I had really intrusive illogical thoughts, but mostly it was the rumination. So the rumination started that day, that idea that it was my fault that she died, and it would kind of pop up like a gopher in quiet moments. And then, 3 weeks later, there wasn't a single moment where it wasn't whispering in my head.
So what do you feel like you should have done?
I don't actually think I should have done anything.
Okay.
There was always a part of me that knew that whatever was going on with my mother had nothing to do with me.
Okay.
And it didn't even occur to me to blame the hospital staff for discharging her or not discovering it, right? That didn't occur to me.
Oh, they discharged her?
Yeah, they didn't find anything. They gave her IV and they said she has a stomach bug. They didn't discover, and apparently it's very easy to miss a bleeding ulcer. But it didn't even occur to me. The only person it occurred,
Even if it's easy to miss, they missed it.
right? But I felt like it was my fault. I had been with her. I had been watching her.
should have
I
known.
hadn't done
Like it was
more.
on your watch, but it wasn't.
So there were plenty of things that I could come up with. I should have taken her to a different hospital. I should have taken her to the hospital sooner. I should have called somebody else. But really, I think that guilt that made me so ill that I had to check myself into a
I
facility.
would have loved to have freaked out for 28 days.
Listen, it is
Would have
it is
been
a
heaven.
it is
Wouldn't
a
you have loved to
tremendous
drop out
privilege.
for 28
When
days?
Steve died, remember, I had 5 little kids at home.
Yeah.
8, 10, 12, 13, and 17.
See, I had a 14-year-old at home and 2 daughters, so you can't freak out. And,
No,
and also
and-
my husband was freaking out.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
So-
I mean, I was kind of myself in like a fetal position
Yeah,
up in my
yeah,
room.
you were
and
freaked
my
out,
friends and
overwhelming
family.
thoughts,
Right. But
overwhelmed.
Megan had 3 children too, right?
Yeah, I did. And you know, I do when I think about where I was and how ill I had become.
Yeah.
By the time I
Yeah.
checked myself into a facility, I was no longer able to get up off the floor, even to
wow.
use the bathroom.
Yeah.
I give you credit for saying I've got to do something.
I mean, I really didn't feel like
And
I
your
had
husband
a
must
choice.
have supported you.
Yeah, he did. I mean, so there was a lot of
You knew
privilege.
he was going to be there
and
to
he was
handle
gonna
the
be there with
kids.
the kids.
Yeah, what I don't know is even if he wasn't there, someone would have had to have been there, because to me it felt like either this or get worse and maybe die. I mean, it really felt like if I don't check myself
And we
in.
know that people do die. We
Right.
just
Yeah.
Exactly.
had a show on widows that they die 2 years after the husband.
After Steve died,
You know,
I was
and
at
I
the
don't know with
doctor's.
suicide.
Oh, of course. After Steve died, I was at the doctor's like every 2 months with something. As a matter of fact, I mean, just for a little laughter, my regular doctor, I'll never forget, I was going all the time, and he basically didn't want to see me anymore. He was so aggravated. And one day he said to me, Abby, even hypochondriacs die of cancer. In other words, I was like being a hypochondriac.
Oh, even hypochondriac.
Yeah, even and
Like you
I
had-
switched. No, I switched doctors.
Yeah,
I'm like,
thank you.
that is just,
Wow.
really nice, supportive thing. But I was sick, and I did have a doctor take it seriously. She even once sent me in for chest X-ray. Well, that looks suspicious. I mean, here's the thing, and I still have this. I still have the hypochondria because all my kids, I thought they'll be orphans.
They were counting on
They-
you, of
they'll be,
course.
and even still,
Right.
and now in their 20s and early 30s, I still feel I need to be around. Their dad's not here, for this, that, and the other. Yeah.
I think that's also really common, being afraid that someone else is going to die or that you're going to
absolutely.
die after.
Oh,
a
my
trauma.
gosh.
After a sudden
Your
dramatic loss,
children,
absolutely.
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean,
You're
I still to this
paranoid.
day, I mean, it's
Yeah.
irrational, and I know it is. If
Yeah.
the phone rings at 2 in the morning, I'm like, okay, somebody's died.
It's
I mean,
not totally irrational, because you got one of those
Well,
phone
that's
calls
it.
and
I
somebody
know,
had
right?
died.
No, do you know what
Yeah.
I do? I turn my phone off now because I say it
That's
doesn't
smart.
matter if they die, they're dead. And I need to
Right.
get a good night's sleep because I know what it's
You're in
like
store
to be
for it.
awakened in the middle of the night.
Yes,
right.
and what it's also done for me is when I have friends or family that are having even a slight mental health crisis, I take it really seriously, where I wouldn't have before, because you just don't know.
So this is what I'm wondering, I guess, given the level of emotional, psychological, and physical distress that you are all under because of the sudden traumatic losses, what helped?
Yeah.
I can tell you, even though I complain about it now because I lived in a tiny town with like 1,000 people, it was very helpful. Even though some people didn't know what to say. Like, well, how could he do that to you? You must be mad at him. And I would actually be pretty rude and say, well, would you be mad if your wife had a heart attack and died? Just try to let them understand it was an illness.
Yeah.
He didn't sit there and say, I'm going to do this to my family. But the community was really helpful. They were there 100%. And so I think having that sense of community, family, friends, and talk about it and lean. It's really hard because my father didn't take it well. Oh, he deserted you. My father,
Oh,
kind
wow,
of old school.
yes. He was probably angry.
He was really angry. I mean,
Guys are supposed to support their families.
well,
and, do
nobody.
that.
I'm telling you, this was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
The stigma around suicide
Really different.
was
Yeah.
really bad. It's
Yeah.
slightly better now. So
Hopefully.
I like that you're saying slightly, because we've come a long way and we have a long way to go.
it's
Yeah.
only
agree.
slightly. It's
Yeah,
not.
yeah, yeah.
You don't
Yeah.
talk about suicide the way you would your diabetes
Right.
or getting a new kidney.
I will tell you that my religious community helped me
Yeah.
tremendously. And I said to it was one of our guests later on who was a priest, I said, the theology of my church did not help me at all. I, reading the Bible, doing all that. He said, but my religious community helped me.
people.
The people helped me.
Yeah.
And he said to me,
People.
Gloria, that is who the church is. That's who God works through, is the people. It's the people.
I wish I'd had. My husband was an atheist, and I maybe I'm kind of borderline. I didn't have that.
Yeah.
And that was the other thing. We had 2 huge funerals for my husband. I had to go through 2 of them.
We
'cause he was
had
a
2
public-
also.
He was a public figure,
Yeah,
and
crazy.
the one in my hometown, they did it at a church, even though they said they didn't want to because it was a suicide.
Wow,
So that was like,
that's heartbreaking.
That's
I'm sorry to hear that.
That's terrible. I was just going to say when we said they'd come a long ways, I was going to say, well, hopefully that all churches are letting them have services, you know.
It's hard
there
to
now.
know, but I and I've mentioned this before. What's helped me a lot is doing my podcasts and writing and
Yeah.
lobbying and talking about it because
Yeah.
I worked in politics, so I can use that. And people know. And if I have time, one quick story. One of my sons is in a well-known band, so and they've heard my story. Some of the followers, and a woman reached out to me. I'm sure she wouldn't mind me sharing, from Germany. 2 little boys, and her husband had just died by suicide 2 months ago. And one of the son had loved the bass. My son's a bass player, and he was 11, and he dropped everything and just went to bed. Dropped his music, but then he was told about my son and his father, and my son actually wrote him an email, and he picked up the bass, formed a band, and he's doing much better.
Wow.
So,
Well,
you know,
I was going to say,
Wonderful.
music is a great way to work through things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Heidi, what helped you? One last thing before we go.
It was difficult. I mean, being 20 and having a 17-year-old brother die is,
Can't even imagine.
people they can't relate to you. I think for years I put my grief on a shelf, to be honest with you, and was worried about my parents and everybody else. And then once I found a group of other bereaved siblings, that's what helped me.
Through the Compassionate Friends.
Yes, and it helped me because when I said things like, I think the wrong child died, people didn't say that's ridiculous. Of course they didn't. They gave me a space, and I realized that other siblings felt the same way and had the same experiences.
Yep.
So it was meeting people like us that have
really
had losses.
helpful. I wish there was nothing like that with suicide.
Yeah.
There were other kinds of deaths, but
Well, I think doing our podcast together all these years, we've been doing it for 20
I'm
years.
so in awe. I'm so in awe of what
Podcasting
you guys
before people
do.
knew what podcasting was.
That's
we
been
did
helpful.
online radio.
Yeah, we've
Okay,
done-
tell us quickly where people can find you. Start with you.
Just, Google my name. You'll get my website, Meghan Riordan-Jarvis. And if that is too hard to spell, Grief is My Side Hustle is my podcast. You'll find my website. You can get in touch with me there on Instagram, all the socials.
And she does speaking and everything all over the world. She's amazing. Okay, Abby.
Best way is probably through either my Twitter, Abby Dart. You can message me; it's open. My Wolf Mom Instagram is very active. Feel free to reach out.
Awesome. I love it. Well, we want to thank everybody
Yes,
for
thank
joining
you.
us on this show today, and thank Abby and
Thank you so much.
and
Been an
Megan,
honor.
thank
and
you.
Megan for being on. It's been amazing, great information. And Heidi and I want to thank everybody for joining us on this show today. And we always want to remind you, if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.